So I would like to now introduce Brian Harrison, who's our vice chairman, a former chairman as well, and he's going to offer Terry Heyward's talk on the R34 and the double crossing of the Atlantic back in 1919. Okay, Brian, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to Terry for his talk and slides. So let's start with the R34 and the double crossing of the Atlantic. If you check on Google for significant events of 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, thus formally ending the war with Germany, and the German fleet was scuttled at Scapa Flow. There's no mention of this subject, although further research mentions Alcock and Brown's epic first flight across the Atlantic from Newfoundland to Ireland. If you ask people about flights across the Atlantic, most remember Alcock and Brown, but very few have even heard of the R34. The story of the R34 and the first east to west and return crossing of the Atlantic starts with the capture of the nearly intact German Super Zeppelin L-33 on the 24th of September 1916. The design of this rigid airship was so far ahead of anything that the British were building at the time that the Admiralty decreed that work on a new class of airship was to begin immediately, based very closely on this L-33. This new class began with, by numerical coincidence, the R34, built at Barrow-in-Furness. However, the contract to build the R34 was awarded to the firm of William Beardmore and Company at Inchinnan near Glasgow. This was to be a very Scottish airship with the unusual feature of a bow plate carrying the lion rampant of Scotland and the motto Pro Patria Volens, which means to fly for one's country. It is believed to be the only British airship to carry a bow plate of any kind. The actual construction started on 9th of December 1917 and was 643 feet long. She had 5 Maori Sunbeam engines of French design, as the preferred British engines were not available, although there were doubts about the performance of the French engines. The 19 gas bags filled much of the ship. The bags were made from goldbeater skin, a material that was impervious to hydrogen. The downside of using this material, and clearly a problem for the future of airships, is that the inner intestine of the ox that needed that, and there were over 750,000 animals were needed for the R34's gas bags alone. The framework was made of aluminium alloy. This picture shows the internal configuration. There was space between the outer framework and the gas bags where water and fuel was stored, along with the crew hammocks, provisions, a walkway running along the keel, and access to inspect and repair the bags. The hammocks where the crew slept were in an especially precarious position, as they were above the outer envelope, and anyone falling from their hammock would have gone straight through. Captain appointed to R34 was Major George Herbert Scott. At this point, I should mention a bizarre mix of ranks and services associated with the R34. Although the airship was the property of the Admiralty, the crew were the responsibility of the RAF. To confuse matters even further, many of the ranks appeared to be Army, as they dated back to the pre-April 1918 era of the Royal Flying Corps. A number of the crew had been Royal Naval Air Service personnel and still wore their naval uniforms. The first real trial of the ship was when Major Scott, accompanied by the Admiralty Acceptance Officer, Colonel Hicks, made an eventful 19-hour flight round the Irish Sea. Not only were problems experienced in the air, but there was further drama when the ship returned to Inchinnan with reduced gas and inexperienced ground crew. The airship was hauled down too rapidly and the rear car was pushed up into the hull, fortunately without anyone being injured. This was to be a crucial event in the race to make the first air crossing of the Atlantic, as had it not been for the delay while the R34 was being repaired, it would have beaten Alcock and Brown to make the first crossing. As it was, the R34 did not arrive at her new permanent home at East Fortune in the east of Scotland until the 30th of May, following a 21-hour flight over the North Sea. After a short training flight over the 4th, the R34 was sent on a mammoth 56-hour flight around the Baltic as a show of strength in an effort to encourage the German government to finally ratify the peace treaty that was eventually signed on the 28th of June 1919. Final confirmation was given to Major Scott that the Atlantic crossing was to go ahead with departure on the 2nd of July. The official planned time for departure had been fixed as 2 a.m. on Wednesday, the 2nd of July 1919. At midnight, the crew ate a hearty supper and drank the health of Tiny, as they had christened the ship. Before donning their heavy flying suits and taking their places in the airship, a tractor laboriously pulled aside the heavy hangar sliding doors. Major Scott gave the order, "Walk her out," and at about 1 a.m., Tiny emerged from her shed, pulled by 400 airmen, 80 service women, and 150 soldiers of the Black Watch. Local weather was not really favourable. There was low cloud and mist, a light northeast wind, and there was light rain falling. However, the forecast for the Atlantic was good, so Scott and his officers took the decision to proceed. The engine telegraph rang out, and the 5 engines started. The ship was manoeuvred into the wind, and at 1:42 a.m., a bugle blast signalled, "Let her go." The R34 rose and was immediately swallowed up by the low cloud. The great adventure had begun. The captain in the forward control car was the steering coxswain, Sergeant Munro Watson, and the elevator coxswain, Walter Mays, who stood facing right and sideways to the line of flight, controlling the elevator wheel and watching the inclinometer. Arguably, his task was the more vital of the two, because not only did he have to watch the instruments, but he also sensed the trim of the ship through his feet. Behind these three were the navigation officer, Major Cook, and others. To one side, and in full view of everyone, hung a huge dial of the altimeter so that this vital information could not be overlooked. The facilities for both flying and navigation were rather different from those available to Alcock and Brown in their cramped and open cockpit. As this sketch shows, the control cabin was definitely more spacious. Not only was it enclosed, but it also afforded the navigators much more space and a table on which to work. Pictures are actually a little deceiving because the cabin was only just over 6 feet wide. There was also the advantage of the relative leisure afforded by the slower speed, averaging at best between 45 and 55 knots, and a considerably greater endurance. Major Cook also had the assistance of wireless and meteorological specialists, as well as the assistance of the ship's captain. Although Scott was the captain of R34, Brigadier General, then Air Commodore Edward Maitland, was on board. He was Britain's most senior airship officer, and it was rumoured that it would have taken an Act of Parliament to stop him making this trip. Much of the record of the flight comes from Maitland's diary. According to Maitland's diary, Major Scott spent much time at the chart table. Cook had faith in the ability of the radio to assist them. Their original navigation plan was to map read across Scotland and then fly a great circle route across the Atlantic, fixing their position by means of directional radio bearings for as long as possible, and thereafter rely on drift and ground speed observations backed by astro position lines and fixes. Cook was soon to discover that the reliability of direction-finding wireless telegraph left much to be desired. In his report after the flight, he stated that this was virtually useless and that considerable development was needed. Once the Atlantic had been conquered, they would resort to map reading and ground speed and drift finding. Although Cook intended to use astro as a backup for his navigation, he estimated that there would have been an error of some 50 miles. The navigation equipment. There was a star globe, which I think is in the next slide, which was carried to enable easier identification of the heavenly bodies. In addition to this comparative plethora of equipment, they had the necessary charts and a veritable library of nautical tables, almanacs, star and sun bearing, and azimuth tables. 2 books on meteorology and cloud studies and communications charts. The charts showed the anticipated position and courses of ships in the Atlantic, and appropriate radio frequencies. He also carried Holmes lights for use as flares to assist in drift and ground speed finding. He also had the assistance of an onboard meteorological officer, Lieutenant Harris. Although not strictly part of the navigation team, perhaps the most hard-worked officer on the flight was Second Lieutenant Shotter, the engineering officer, who had the task of keeping the 5 Sunbeam Maori engines running. These were to prove troublesome throughout the flight, which would have been completed more quickly with more efficient engines, of course. They also carried 2 carrier pigeons. But back to the flight. After entering cloud at 100 feet, with the cheers of the crowd crew ringing in their ears, Cook sets a course northwest for Rosyth and Clyde, and Scott released a 1/4 ton of water ballast to climb to 1,500 feet. It is worth remembering that when an airship is setting out on a long-distance flight carrying her maximum load of fuel, she can only rise to a limited height without throwing some of it overboard as ballast. As she proceeds, the captain can, if he wishes, gradually increase her height as the fuel is consumed. Scott needs to keep the ship as low as possible, but at the same time fly over Scotland in the dark, where the mountains can rise to nearly 4,000 feet. At 2:15 in the morning, they can see the ground and head up the Firth of Forth. Their estimated ground speed is 60 knots, with a 20 knots tailwind. 10 minutes later, they experience violent bumps, enough to make the ship's bow rise 24 degrees, and the liquid in the inclinometer to disappear altogether. Harris tells them at 6,000 feet they could climb above this katabatic turbulence. Unfortunately, without disregarding valuable fuel, they cannot climb, so they endure the discomfort. 3.5 hours after takeoff, they pass Innistralin Island, the last land that they will see before reaching Newfoundland. They soon find themselves flying in cloud, with view of neither sea nor sky, flying westward on an estimated ground speed of 45 knots. 4 hours later, they are still flying between cloud layers. As the higher cloud thinned, Scott kept the ship just in cloud to avoid overheating and thus any loss of gas through expansion. Here the skill of the elevator coxswain comes to the fore when he manages to control the ship so that Cook, who has climbed 100 feet to the top of the ship, is able to take sunshots with the cloud at his shoulders, an eerie sight for any passing seagull. This cartoon was later drawn by Cranwell cadet Frank Whittle, the inventor of the jet engine. Glimpses of the sea allow Cook to calculate their drift and ground speed by observation of wave crests and the use of a stopwatch. He also calculated drift and ground speed by measuring the angle and timing the change of the shadow of the ship on the surface of the sea. This becomes very difficult if an accurate height of the ship is not known. Without an accurate sea level pressure setting, true altitude cannot be measured. They had hoped to rely on readings given by 2 warships, the battle cruisers Tiger and Renown, and other ships in the area. The 2 warships had been pre-positioned as a safety measure and also to provide meteorological information and pressure settings. But not within radio range of any of the ships, they would experience large errors in their indicated altitudes, which in the worst case could lead to flying into the sea. They experimented by lowering a barometer on a line down to sea level and lifting it quickly. This did not prove successful. Later in the flight, they calculated their height by observation of the ship's shadow on the sea surface. Using the sextant to measure the angle subtended by the length of the shadow, and knowing that the length of the ship was 640 feet, they calculated their true height to be 2,100 feet. The aneroid barometer indicated 1,200 feet, an apparent error of some 900 feet, thankfully on the safe side. When they obtained an accurate pressure setting from a ship some 50 to 60 miles away, they found that the indicated error was 1,000 feet, thus proving the accuracy of their improvised method. At 11 a.m. on Thursday, they received their last directional wireless reading from Clifton, west coast of Ireland. They were now flying on only 2 of their 5 engines in order to conserve fuel, but were still maintaining quite a good speed, according to Maitland. The accuracy of which may be a little doubtful because they find that the pitot tube became filled with fog and rain and needs hauling in to be blown out. 2 p.m., some 9 hours since their last measurement, Cook manages to get a measurement of drift off the sea. They're still getting good communications with St. John's, East Fortune, Clifton, and the Azores. At about the same time, a stowaway discovered, Palatine, who had been one of the original crew, but was left behind to save fuel until discovered. Maitland notes in his log that had they been over land beneath the ship, instead of the ocean, he would have been put them off at once in a parachute. Instead, he served the rest of the flight working as a cook and by pumping fuel to the engines. Shortly after this, another stowaway is discovered, Hopsy, a tabby cat who had first flown on the R34's acceptance flight. The Met officer, by observations of the cloud forecasts a depression, and its pressure is confirmed by a radio message from HMS Tiger. Knowing that in the hot northern hemisphere winds travel anti-clockwise around pressure, he decided to take advantage of the favorable wind ahead of the weather feature. At 8 p.m., Maitland comments on how the ship is heavy due to the change in temperature, and that it is flying 12 degrees down by the stern. They decide that flying in and out of cloud using all 5 engines is more economical than to drop the fuel as ballast in order to climb. They steer towards the setting sun. After taking one last sunshot, they descend to below the cloud layer to obtain a drift and ground speed. They are steering 265 degrees true at 40 knots. At night, the ship is lit by electricity throughout, with lights for every instrument. In case of failure, all figures and indicators are also radionized. So luminous are they that they can, in most cases, no light is necessary to see them. And also during the night, Cook takes observations from the planet Venus. At 2:56 a.m. on Thursday, they make their last radio contact with East Fortune, having been airborne over 24 hours. At 9:20 a.m., Cook takes sun observations and calculates position to be 53 degrees north, 36 degrees, 60 minutes west. Ground speed, 30 knots. He considers his fix to be accurate to within 30 to 40 miles. They had reached the halfway point across the Atlantic. At 10 a.m., Scott alters course a little to the north to take advantage of the predicted wind to the north of approaching depression. By 1:30 p.m., their drift is 30 degrees. They're practically travelling sideways, according to Maitland. Shortly afterwards, Maitland comments that Scott and Cook spend much of their time at the chart table with protractors, dividers, stopwatches, and many navigation textbooks measuring angles of drift and calculating course made good. When the sea is visible, they are not the only measure of course and speed with aid of drift indicator, but also by timing the ship's shadow passing a defined spot, such as foam left by a breaking wave. At 4:30, Scott obtains a good sun observation using the sea horizon. The wind speed is now 45 knots and backing, drift now 50 degrees. 90 minutes later, their drift is 70 degrees. Just after a fierce squall, which Harris says indicates the centre of the depression. Maitland comments on how, throughout the flight, Harris astonishes the rest of the crew with his meteorological knowledge and ability to read clouds and appreciate their meaning. By 8:30 p.m., they are flying at 3,400 feet and out of the depression. On Friday at 5:30 a.m., Cook obtains his first astro position line for nearly 12 hours. This was also his last astro sighting. Throughout the trip, he only managed to obtain 17. Of these, only one was an actual fix using Polaris and 3 other stars, which gave him a position 27 miles west-southwest of his DR position. At 8:45 a.m., they receive a bearing from Cape Race of 36 degrees east of north. 12:50 on Friday, they sight the northeast coast of Newfoundland, and at 2:30 p.m. fly over the coast at 1,500 feet. Maitland notes that they crossed the coast on the northwest side of Trinity Bay. This is some 60 miles north of St. John, and if their original Great Circle track was for Halifax, then we reckon they were just about on track. From now on, they map read, mainly by physical features, towns and settlements and continue to measure track and ground speed. Just after midnight, they're 500 miles from New York, and recognizing that they may be short of fuel, they decide that they have three options. A, be towed in by a surface vessel. B, drop down to 300 feet and drop a sea anchor in order to refuel from a destroyer. Or C, land at Boston, refuel, and proceed to New York. They decide that diversion to Boston is the best option and advise New York accordingly. At 4:10 a.m. on Saturday, they cross American soil at Chatham and decide to continue to New York. On arrival at New York at 9:40 New York time, they find that Major Fuller and the majority of the 200 pre-positioned ground crew have driven to Boston for their expected diversion. Therefore, Major Pritchard volunteers to take his place and descends by parachute. They land at 1:54 GMT, 9:54 New York time, 3,130 nautical miles in 108 hours and 12 minutes. As Major Pritchard landed on the ground under his Guardian Angel parachute, he made history as the first person to arrive in the United States by air. Pritchard had clearly left his camera on board since it had recorded his descent from above, and cameras on the ground also captured the historic descent. It is thanks to Major Pritchard that we have so many pictures of the flight taken on board the airship. His camera and binoculars are now on display at the Museum of Flight at East Fortune in Scotland. On the 6th of July, after 108 hours in the air, the R34 was in need of servicing and repair. There had only been 140 gallons of petrol remaining, and during the crossing, a considerable amount of gas had been vented. Although much of the supplies of fuel and gas had been sent to the diversion airfield, the supplies were soon returned to Hazelhurst Field, along with the 200 ground crew who had been sent to Boston. Over 1,000 troops, many from the United States Air Service, remained to handle the airship, and a routine was soon established. Had a hangar been available, it would have been much easier and possibly a longer stay in America contemplated. Much had to be done, with the replenishment of the hydrogen gas, 4,500 gallons of petrol, 800 gallons of ballast and drinking water, 230 gallons of engine oil, 120 of the spark plugs in the troublesome engines, and repairs to the envelope that had been torn over the Atlantic. Further damage was to occur on the ground, however, when a storm crossed Mineola on the Sunday, and the rear gondola suffered damage against the ground. The following day, more damage occurred when the forward mooring point tore loose in the strong winds that followed the storm, leaving a long tear in the envelope, although there was little structural damage. The mooring point was repaired using wood and wire strops. Of the two stowaways, William Ballantyne was destined to return home by sea with the ground crew, partly no doubt in punishment, and seemingly his only other punishment, other than being taken off flying duties for a year, was partly because there was already a full complement. Opsy was more fortunate in being allowed to return by air, despite Graham having been offered $1,000 for her by a wealthy actress. Two further crew members were left behind, a wireless operator and a rigger, and they were replaced by two additional engineers to help Lieutenant Shotter keep the troublesome Sunbeam engines running. Lieutenant Commander Lansdowne, who had represented the US Navy on the crossing, was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Hensley, representing the US Army. Before takeoff, the ship had been thoroughly searched because of the number of charming ladies, Maitland's words, not mine, who had declared their intention of making the return journey as stowaways. I wonder how thoroughly they searched. A cask of rum was thrown into the control car by an admirer just as the airship was released from her ropes, this at a time of prohibition. They took off Wednesday, 9th of July, 11:54 p.m. They picked out this by searchlights over Times Square, and the weather appears to have been favourable. There was a depression west of Newfoundland and another centre to the north of Ireland, with an anticyclone over the East Atlantic and Great Britain. Therefore, they expected a southwest to west wind of about 45 knots over the greater part of the Atlantic, giving them a ground speed of some 70 knots. Their route is to the south of the outbound flight. They're carrying a large quantity of mail, and Maitland talks about this being a forerunner of a regular interchange of mail and goods east to west and vice versa. Throughout both flights, Maitland frequently makes notes about how the airship could be utilised as a passenger and freight carrier. Maitland also noted that in the most turbulent conditions, there is no sensation of seasickness or air sickness. He also commented on the need to improve facilities such as sleeping arrangements and cooking facilities. On the outbound flight, they relied on a metal plate fixed to the exhaust of one of the engines. He regretted the lack of frying facilities and the lack of vegetables and fresh fruit. The latter was remedied on the return flight. They decide to fly straight to London in order to see how long it will take to fly from Broadway to Piccadilly Circus. On board, they discussed the problems of obtaining and recording meteorological information about upper air conditions over the Atlantic, and agreed that a low-cost solution would be to equip all cable repair ships with a meteorological officer with suitable outfit of kites and instruments. By 4:30 p.m., they had travelled 900 miles in 16 hours. Their ground speed was 52 knots and their drift 30 degrees. During the flight, they made further use of angle of shadow to correct barometric changes. Friday, 3:20 a.m., Cook obtains a full star fix. After the loss of one engine in the rear car, they decide to go straight to East Fortune rather than to fly over London. This decision was later confirmed when forecast winds became less favourable and even the possibility of landing in Ireland was considered. Late on Thursday, Maitland notes, the remaining pigeon appears to be very happy. I should have mentioned that the other had escaped while being exercised at Mineola and was later picked up by a westbound steamer some 800 miles out in the Atlantic. At midday, they received a weather report from the Air Ministry informing them that there is an anticyclone off southwest Ireland. They changed heading to the north in order to take advantage of more favourable wind. At 8:45, there is the first mention of the use of calcium flare to establish drift, but the regret is expressed that they have no means of measuring angle of depression and that in future they must have an instrument to do this. They also agree in future that flares must have some sort of flotation device. Saturday the 12th, 6 a.m., no astro observations for over 12 hours. 10 a.m., received a signal from the Air Ministry ordering them to land at Fulham in Norfolk. This is greeted with dismay because according to weather conditions, the weather conditions were better at East Fortune, and of course the crew's wives, families and sweethearts are at East Fortune. By midday, frustration and nerves are beginning to show. Maitland observed, there is little doubt that a crew doing a lot of long-distance journeys would in time suffer from some sort of nerves unless given considerable amounts of leave. Maitland, Cook and Scott have several discussions about the problems of aerial navigation. Cook believed that even with the instruments available at the time, it should be possible to estimate a position in mid-Atlantic to an accuracy of 40 miles. He felt that until directional wireless proved more reliable, a bubble sextant should be especially designed and would probably give an accuracy of within about 10 miles. He commented on how infrequently they had been able to see the sea and sky at the same time. Indeed, how infrequently they had even been able to take drift sighting from the sea. He also agreed that it was essential to have an instrument to measure the depth of cloud below the ship in order to avoid the potentially dangerous manoeuvre of descending too close to the ocean. At 7:30 p.m., they sight the same two islands as Alcock and Brown had done on their flight. Maitland comments, what a strange and happy coincidence. Just after sighting land, Maitland notes that it might have been wiser to have taken a more northerly course in order to take advantage of the influence of the wind around the depression. He comments that undoubtedly the captains of future airship liners will become wily and cunning masters of the art of selecting the right wind and right height, and by means of their air knowledge alone will save many hours upon long sea and air passages. Sunday, 13th of June. They arrive over Fulham at 6:20 a.m. and they land at 6:57 a.m. A journey of 3,314 nautical miles in 75 hours and 3 minutes, 33 hours quicker than the outbound flight. Despite giving the landing party, and the band in particular, a soaking from the discharge of water ballast, the R34 was greeted with cheers, but no large crowds, and was hauled down to be walked into the Fulham hangar alongside her sister, the R33. Only now could Major Scott leave the control car to be handed a telegram from King George V that read, "I heartily congratulate you all on your safe return after the completion of your memorable and indeed unique transatlantic air voyage." And so ended the first east-west crossing of the Atlantic and the first double crossing. The R34 eventually returned to her base at East Fortune just under 3 weeks later with a flight lasting 13 hours that included a diversion to fly over London. The weather-beaten ship was now in need of a refit. The transatlantic flight and her crew were largely ignored in Britain, and there was no official recognition of their achievement. Even an audience with the King for Maitland and Scott brought no immediate reward. The King is said to have shown more interest in the 2 homing pigeons carried than the welfare of the crew. While it was widely expected that following the knighthood of Alcock and Brown, honours would follow for Maitland and Scott, this was not forthcoming. Awards were eventually given, though with respect to the enormous achievement, they were limited. Scott was given a CBE, while Maitland, Cook, Harris and Shorter were given the AFC. Scott already had an AFC from the war. Even promotions were not forthcoming. In contrast, the US Naval Secretary approved a proposal for the whole crew to be awarded Navy Crosses, although when it was discovered that the UK government did not intend making similar awards, this was not implemented for fear of it being taken as a diplomatic rebuff. After a 6-month refit, the ship was reassigned first to Fulham and then to Howden in Yorkshire. By this stage, the R34 had become virtually obsolete, and with little interest in airships from the RAF, the R34 made no further flights in 1920. Despite this, modifications continued to be made. It was at this time that the unique bow plate with the Scottish line was removed, and although no coupling was ever fitted, the bow plate remained in store. Finally, on 27th of January 1921, the R34 flew again for what was to prove to be her last flight. The crew for this flight was very different from the transatlantic crew, with a new captain and a relatively inexperienced crew. The story of this final flight is a complicated one that was full of errors and blunders by those in the ship and those on the ground, and warrants a lot more time than we're able to give it today. Sufficient to say, perhaps, that after a disastrous and error-strewn flight, during which she hit a hill, the ship was struck by a fierce storm on her moorings and was damaged beyond repair. Within a few days, all the usable equipment had been removed from the R34, and the framework was chopped up with axes for scrap. A sad end for an otherwise successful airship. A few components survive today at the Museum of Flight in Scotland. A lot of some of the Atlantic crossing crew was not much better. Tragically, a number of key personnel involved in our R34 story were to lose their lives later in the year when the R38 broke up and plunged into the Humber while on trials from Howden. Among those who died were Edward Maitland and John Pritchard. Ironically, Pritchard had reported on the need for extensive testing of the R38, but his recommendations were ignored. Other deaths included aircraftsman Parker, who was on the transatlantic flight, and Archie Campbell, Scott's father-in-law, who was involved in the design and building of the R34. It would not be until the 4th of May, 1957, that a memorial to the transatlantic flight was unveiled by the Duke of Hamilton outside the guardroom of the old RNAS East Fortune station. 5 of the original transatlantic crew members were present. The following year, the Air League of the British Empire unveiled another identical memorial at Mineola on the site of Hazelhurst Field, now Roosevelt Field. This memorial has now been saved from a shopping mall development of the site and is in the nearby Cradle of Aviation Museum on the old Mitchell Field site. And I think we'd all rather remember the ship and her crew in her blue livery, as she may have appeared And that is the end of Terry's talk. Thank you very much, Terry, and I hope everyone enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Okay, now supposedly it's sharing. Can you see the picture of the R34?
We can, yes.
Yep.
Okay, these were just recently uncovered from the Kentucky Historical Society, because the fellow who took the pictures donated them to the society, and we didn't even know about them or would never have looked for them. And what's interesting is this shows that at the time of landing, the U.S. Navy had sent out a C-type non-rigid airship, which I assume was to coordinate the landing in some way. And I'm going to change the picture now to the next one. And you see at the time, there was also an observation balloon or kite balloon there, probably with the intention of being able to raise it to show the location of the landing field if there had been fog. The trouble is none of this really matches the historic record, because I believe the U.S. Army was trying to horn in on the whole rigid airship thing so much that when they made the motion pictures that you and I used to make that video, you don't see any Navy airship or even the observation balloon anywhere near there. So it's probably, there's just a little bit of rivalry going on there, is why the historical record is the way it is. Now let me change the picture one more time, and you'll see a close-up of what we believe to be the C1, even though he labels it the C5, the more famous one, but it was long gone by then. This is probably the most interesting picture, the repair work going on after the break for the storm during the night that was mentioned in the presentation. This ladder, likewise all the hydrogen bottles and everything that you see in the motion pictures, probably came from the nearby Naval Air Station. It was only about 20 miles away. I just thought I'd throw that in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Absolutely fantastic when, again, you can share pictures like this that really, again, enhance what we've been talking about. And again, showing that new pictures and things and parts of the story are coming to light. I didn't know about the airship and the observation balloon as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Richard, it's Giles. The observation balloon would also have shown the wind direction at different altitudes.
Notice how the Army, if you look at our video, you'll notice the Army who took all the motion pictures. There's absolutely no evidence that the Navy was ever there.